There was a time when being human did not mean being alone. 100,000 years ago, the world did not belong to a single kind of human body, a single kind of face, or a single path of survival. Across cold valleys, warm forests, island shores and dark caves, different human species were breathing under the same sky. Some would vanish, some would leave only bones. Some would leave traces inside us. And the strangest question is not only why they disappeared, but why we became the only ones left. So tonight, we begin with one quiet mystery. 100,000 years ago, Earth had more than one human species. To imagine the Earth 100,000 years ago, it helps to loosen one modern habit of thought. Today, when people say human, they usually mean us. They mean one living species, one general body plan, one surviving branch that fills cities, villages, islands, deserts, forests, and cold northern towns. But if we move backward through deep time, before written names, before farming, before temples, before any memory that could be carried in language from parent to child until now, that simple word begins to open. Human was not yet a single face looking back from the dark. It was a wider family of bodies, scattered across different lands, shaped by different climates, and carrying different histories inside bone, muscle, skin, and breath. Homo sapiens were already here, but we were not alone. In Africa, our own ancestors were living through changing grasslands, river margins, wooded places, and dry seasons that tested the body again and again. Beyond Africa, other human relatives had already made older homes. Some were adapted to colder worlds. Some lived in landscapes where stone, animal trails, caves, and seasonal hunger formed the shape of every day. Their lives were not waiting for us to arrive. They had their own long past, their own dead, their own children, their own ways of finding food, making tools, enduring weather, and reading danger in the land. The beginning of the human story, then, is not a straight road leading calmly toward modern people. It is closer to a dim landscape at night, where several fires burn far apart, each one held by a different kind of human life. From our distance, the fires look small, but for those who sat beside them, each fire was the center of a world. 100,000 years ago, the planet was still in the Pleistocene, a long age of shifting climate, ice sheets, warmer intervals, expanding grasslands, shrinking forests, and moving coastlines. These changes did not affect all human groups in the same way. A body that survived well in one place might struggle in another. A group that knew one valley could be trapped when the climate changed around it. Another group might move along rivers, coastlines, or open country, carrying tools and habits into unfamiliar ground. Homo sapiens were part of this restless world, but so were Neanderthals in parts of Europe and Western Asia, and other human relatives whose traces are harder to see. When we speak about the origin of our species, it is important to remember that origin does not mean instant victory. Our ancestors were not born into an empty earth. They came from one branch among several, and for a long time their future was not guaranteed. The strange thing is that each of these human forms was real enough to leave marks, yet fragile enough to nearly disappear from ordinary memory. A skull in a cave, a broken tool, a layer of ash, a cut bone, a fragment of ancient DNA. These are not grand monuments, but they are quiet signs that the world once held more human variety than it does now. The people behind those signs did not know they would become evidence. They woke in cold mornings, carried tired bodies across ground, listened for animals, watched storms gather, and slept in places where darkness still belonged to many species. Some may have seen Homo sapiens. Some may have avoided them. Some may have shared landscapes for generations without leaving a clear story behind. From the viewpoint of deep human origins, that is the first unsettling truth. The word human once had more than one living answer. It could mean different bodies under different skies, each shaped by the same broad evolutionary family, yet not identical to us. To look back 100,000 years is not only to ask where we came from, it is to stand before a quieter question. What did Earth lose when all those other ways of being human faded from the world? Modern people live inside a very narrow version of the word human. It feels natural to us, because everywhere we look today, the answer seems the same. A child born in a mountain village, a worker crossing a city street, an old person sitting quietly near a window, a fisherman on an island coast, and a scientist looking at bones in a museum all belong to one living species. Bodies differ in height, skin color, face shape, strength, age, and memory. But beneath those differences, the biological frame is shared. Because this is the only human world we have ever seen, the mind begins to treat it as if it must always have been this way. We imagine the past with our own loneliness placed inside it. We picture ancient Earth as a stage waiting for Homo sapiens to walk across it, as if other human forms were only rough sketches before the finished figure appeared. That is a comforting mistake, but it is still a mistake. The older world was not arranged around us. It did not know that one branch would someday build cities, write histories, name the others, and wonder why they were gone. 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not the final chapter of anything. They were living animals with uncertain futures, shaped by hunger, birth, injury, weather, family bonds, and the need to move through landscapes that could change faster than tradition could explain. Other human relatives were also doing the same, in other places, with bodies that carried their own long experiments in survival. To understand this, we have to step away from the idea that evolution works like a ladder. A ladder has one direction. It rises from low to high, from simple to advanced, from unfinished to complete. But human origins do not look like that when we slow down and look carefully. They look more like a branching tree, where some branches spread wide, some remain small, some grow in isolation, and some break off without warning. The branch that led to us survived, but survival alone does not mean it was the only meaningful branch. Neanderthals were not failed modern people. Denisovans were not merely shadows waiting to be discovered in our DNA. Small-bodied island humans were not strange side notes written outside the real story. Each belonged to a living population that met the demands of its own place for as long as it could. Their bodies were answers to environments, not errors in a plan. This matters because the modern word human carries an invisible pride. It quietly folds all deep time into ourselves. It makes us feel as though our way of standing, speaking, remembering, making tools, and living in groups is the natural center of the story. But in deep prehistory, there may have been more than one way for a human mind to notice a storm coming, more than one way for human hands to shape stone, more than one way for human families to recognize danger, care for the wounded, or remember where food returned after a hard season. We must be careful not to invent details that the evidence cannot hold. We do not know their inner lives in the full sense. We cannot hear their voices, recover their stories, or watch them look at the night sky. Still, the bones and traces we do have are enough to disturb the modern habit of thinking. The human family was once wider than our daily experience allows. The origin of us was not a clean beginning, but a place inside a crowded biological past. That crowded past changes the emotional weight of the title question. When we ask why Earth had more than one human species, we are not asking why nature produced a few odd relatives before us. We are asking why the deep past was generous with human possibility, and why the present is so narrow. We are asking why a word that now points to one surviving species once pointed, silently, to several living forms. And we are asking what happens to memory when only one branch remains to name the tree. If someone had stood on a high ridge 100,000 years ago and looked across enough of the earth, the view would have revealed something no living person can witness now. The land itself would not have seemed like another planet. Rivers still cut through valleys, winds still crossed open plains, mountains still held snow, herds still moved along routes shaped by water, grass, cold, and season. But somewhere beyond one horizon, another kind of human was waking beside a different fire. Beyond another horizon, children from another human lineage were learning where to step, what to fear, what sounds meant danger, and which adults to follow through stone, mud, forest, or frozen ground. Far away, separated by deserts, forests, coastlines, mountains, and distances no one could measure in the modern sense, different branches of the human family were living through days that felt complete to them. They were not waiting to become fossils. They were not waiting for Homo sapiens to name them. They did not know that, far in the future, fragments of their bones would be placed in drawers, their teeth would be measured, their DNA would be compared, and their existence would become part of a question asked quietly before sleep. They knew the immediate weight of life. A body needed warmth, a child needed protection, a cut needed time to close, a group needed food before darkness covered the land again. This is the first foundation of the mystery. The ancient human world was not empty, and it was not arranged around us. It was already filled with lives, movements, habits, dangers, and inherited ways of surviving. The reason this is difficult to feel is simple. We already know the ending. We know Homo sapiens survived. We know that our descendants built shelters, crossed seas, planted fields, raised cities, made languages, buried the dead in countless ways, and eventually looked backward into deep time with scientific tools. Because we know the ending, the past begins to look more certain than it really was. It can seem as if every earlier event was quietly leading to us. But 100,000 years ago, no such ending had been announced. Homo sapiens were not the guaranteed heirs of Earth. Neanderthals were not already shadows. Other human relatives were not merely side stories on the way to modern people. Each lineage lived inside its own present, with its own pressures, losses, births, and fragile continuities. When we return to the origin of our own species, this uncertainty becomes essential. Our ancestors already carried many features that belong to our line. They could learn from one another, cooperate, move across difficult ground, make tools, remember places, and adapt with unusual flexibility. Yet these abilities did not protect them from every danger. Climate shifted again and again. A place rich in food could become dry. A route that once opened movement could close. Forests could retreat. Grasslands could spread. Cold could return. Small groups could become isolated. A failed season, an illness, a dangerous migration, or the loss of too many children could change the future of a population without leaving a dramatic sign in the earth. Deep history often turns not through one visible catastrophe, but through many small differences accumulating over time. A few more surviving children, a wider network of contact, a more flexible diet, or a better way to preserve knowledge across generations could slowly tilt survival in one direction. No single morning declared that one human species would remain while others would fade. The archaeological record makes this even more humbling. What survives from that world is only a thin remnant of what once existed. Wooden tools rotted away, temporary shelters dissolved into soil, footprints vanished under rain, wind, rivers, and animal movement. Most bodies never became fossils. Most fires left no clear trace. A life could contain skill, fatigue, affection, fear, grief, and memory, yet leave nothing for the future to hold. A single tooth may stand for thousands of missing lives. A broken stone tool may be the only remaining sign that hands once worked in that place. This is why caution belongs inside the story. The evidence is real, but incomplete. The deeper picture is not a straight march toward us, but a branching landscape of overlapping populations, separation, adaptation, contact, and disappearance. Before asking why only Homo sapiens remain today, we must accept that this outcome was never guaranteed. Earth once held more than one living answer to what it meant to be human, and for a long time, we were only one branch among them. Across much of Europe and Western Asia, one of the strongest fires in that older human world belonged to the Neanderthals. They were not the crude, half-formed creatures that older imagination once placed at the edge of the human story. They were a human lineage, with a long history of their own, shaped by cold landscapes, hard seasons, animal movement, stone, fire, injury, and the repeated need to survive where the body could not be careless. By 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals had already lived through immense stretches of time in lands that were often colder and more demanding than many places where early Homo sapiens were moving. Their bodies carried the marks of that world. They tended to be strongly built, with broad chests, powerful limbs, and physical proportions that many researchers connect with life in colder environments and high-energy conditions. This does not mean every Neanderthal lived in snow, or that their world was one endless winter. Europe and Western Asia changed again and again. Some periods were milder, some were harsher. Forests, open grasslands, rocky valleys, and animal routes shifted with climate. But across these changes, Neanderthals became deeply familiar with landscapes where survival required close attention to season, shelter, fuel, prey, and movement. To think about them honestly, we have to remove the easy picture of a failed human. They were not waiting to be replaced. They were living in places they understood. A Neanderthal group moving through a valley was not a shadow of Homo sapiens. It was a community of human relatives carrying knowledge learned over generations, where stone could be found, where animals might pass, where caves or rock shelters could protect the body from wind, where firewood might be gathered, and when a place no longer offered enough to stay, their tools were not random stones. Their hunting was not blind violence. Their bodies were strong because their lives demanded strength, but strength alone was never enough. A large animal could injure or kill. Cold could drain energy. Hunger could weaken judgment. A broken bone, an infected wound, or the loss of skilled adults could change the future of a small group. Neanderthals lived inside that fragile balance for a very long time. The evidence they left behind is quiet, but it is not empty. Stone tools, animal bones with cut marks, hearths, shelters, pigments in some contexts, and the remains of individuals show a lineage able to endure, adapt, and return again and again to demanding places. There is also evidence that some Neanderthals survived serious injuries, which suggests that at least in certain cases, others must have tolerated weakness, helped the wounded, or allowed individuals who could no longer hunt well to continue living. We should not turn that into a sentimental story beyond the evidence, but neither should we ignore what it implies. A body that had been badly hurt and still lived for years tells us that Neanderthal life was not only muscle against weather, it also involved group presence, dependence, and some form of care. This matters for the central question of the video, because it shows that 100,000 years ago, Earth did not contain one clear human center and several poor copies around it. Neanderthals were an older human answer to a different set of conditions. Their skulls, bones, tools, and living spaces remind us that human origin was not a single shape spreading over an empty map. It was a family of related populations, each pressed by environment into its own path. In the lands of Neanderthals, being human meant knowing cold stone, animal bodies, fire, risk, and the slow memory of difficult terrain. It meant carrying a body built for power and endurance through regions where food and warmth could not be taken for granted. From our modern distance, we know that Neanderthals eventually disappeared as a distinct population, but 100,000 years ago, that ending was not visible. They had already survived for a long time. They had already become part of the land, and if Homo sapiens had looked across those western horizons, they would not have been looking at a lesser version of themselves. They would have been looking at another human way of enduring Earth. If Neanderthals feel close enough for the mind to picture a body beside a fire, Denisovans are different. They enter the human story more like a voice heard through a wall. For a long time, no one could point to a full Denisovan skeleton and say, here is the body of that ancient people. They were not first known through a complete skull, a long row of bones, or a cave filled with clear images of daily life. Their presence became visible through something much smaller and stranger. Fragments, teeth, a finger bone, and ancient DNA powerful enough to reveal that another human lineage had once existed. This makes the Denisovans one of the most unsettling answers to the title question. 100,000 years ago, Earth did not only hold human forms we can easily imagine from skulls and tools, it also held human relatives whose outlines remain faint, whose faces are still difficult to reconstruct, and whose history has to be approached through genetic traces carried across time. To think about Denisovans is to accept that the ancient human world was wider than the fossil record first seemed to show. A few small remains from a cave in Siberia helped open the door, but the genetic signal did not stay there. DNA related to Denisovans appears in some living populations today, especially in parts of Oceania, and also in varying traces among some Asian populations. That pattern suggests a past much larger than one cave, one valley, or one small group. It points toward a human lineage that must have occupied or influenced a broad and complex geography, even if its bones have rarely survived or rarely been recognized. The quiet shock is this. A people can be nearly invisible in stone and still leave a biological echo inside living humans. They can vanish from ordinary memory, disappear as a separate population, and yet remain detectable in the deep inheritance of bodies born tens of thousands of years later. This brings us back to the beginning of our own species in a more complicated way. Homo sapiens did not move into a world where every human relative was obvious, easy to classify, or neatly separated. The old human landscape may have been filled with populations that were related, divided, mixed, adapted to different places, and sometimes known to one another only at the edges of their ranges. Denisovans remind us that the map of ancient humanity was not drawn in clear ink. Some lines are still faint. Some may never become sharp. Their world may have included highlands, forests, cold regions, warmer corridors, and places where human groups moved over long periods as climate changed. We should be careful here, because the evidence does not allow us to describe Denisovan daily life with the same confidence that we can sometimes bring to Neanderthals. We do not know exactly how most Denisovans looked. We do not know the full range of their tools, shelters, social life, or beliefs. We cannot turn a few fragments of evidence into a complete portrait. But that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the truth. Deep human history is not only made of what we know clearly, it is also shaped by what remains partly hidden. In the sleep of the earth, many human lives passed without leaving full bodies behind. Their bones broke down, their camps vanished, their fires cooled into soil. Their names, if they had anything like names, disappeared beyond recovery. Yet their existence can still disturb the modern belief that humanity was always simple. Denisovans show that another kind of human could live, move, meet other populations, pass on genes, and still remain almost faceless to us. That is why they matter so deeply in a video about a world with more than one human species. They are not just an obscure scientific discovery. They are a reminder that the human past contains hidden rooms. We have opened only a few doors. Behind one of them, a small bone fragment became evidence of a whole missing branch. Behind another, the DNA of living people became a record of encounters no story had preserved. And in that quiet space between bone and blood, Denisovans ask us to imagine an Earth where other human beings were real, breathing, adapting, and raising children, even when time left us almost nothing of their faces. On the islands of Southeast Asia, the older human world becomes even stranger, not because it needs exaggeration, but because islands can change the direction of evolution in ways that feel almost difficult to accept at first. Far from the large cold ranges of Neanderthals, and far from the hidden genetic shadow of Denisovans, there were human relatives whose small bodies suggest a different kind of survival story. Homo floresiensis, found on the island of Flores in Indonesia, is one of the most famous examples. The remains are limited, and scientists continue to discuss details, but the broad picture is clear enough to matter here. The human family was not only varied across continents, it also reached islands, where isolation, limited resources, unusual animals, and long separation could reshape bodies over time. When people today imagine ancient humans, they often picture a single line of taller, stronger, more modern forms rising step by step toward us. Island humans make that picture harder to keep. They show that evolution does not always move toward larger bodies, bigger brains, or forms that look more like modern Homo sapiens. In some environments, especially on islands, smaller bodies can become part of a long survival answer. A smaller body may require less food. A population cut off from large mainland groups may follow its own path. Animals on islands often change size across generations, and human relatives were not outside nature's pressure. This does not make them less human in the broad evolutionary sense. It makes them evidence that being human was once more flexible, more local, and more deeply shaped by place than our modern imagination usually allows. To think of Homo floresiensis is to picture a world where another human lineage may have walked under tropical skies, moved through forested and volcanic landscapes, made tools, found food, avoided danger, and raised children on an island that held its own rules. Their lives were not small because their bodies were small. For the individuals living there, the island was not a side note in a scientific debate. It was the whole world. The ground, the weather, the food sources, the animals, the caves, the paths through vegetation, and the memory of where to go in a hard season would have shaped every day. This returns us to the origin of humanity in an important way. Our beginnings were never only about one body spreading outward and replacing emptiness. They were about many related populations meeting different environments, and sometimes being changed so strongly by those environments that their bodies became almost surprising to later observers. Homo floresiensis also reminds us that the fossil record can preserve a form of humility. For a long time, no one looking only at modern people would have guessed that such a human relative had existed so recently in deep time. The discovery widened the emotional map of prehistory. It suggested that the Earth of the past contained human possibilities that do not fit comfortably inside a simple ladder from primitive to advanced. Alongside large-brained humans, cold-adapted humans, and genetically hidden humans, there were also island humans, whose bodies carried the signature of isolation. We must be cautious and not fill the gaps with invented scenes. We do not know every detail of their social life, language, inner world, or beliefs. We do not know what they thought when night came, or how they understood death, weather, or danger. But the evidence is enough to show that their existence belonged inside the wider human story. They were part of a planet where several human forms could exist in different ecological rooms at the same time. Some rooms were cold and continental. Some were vast and partly hidden across Asia. Some were small, islanded, and fragile. Each demanded a different answer from the body. The human family, then, was not a single flame burning brighter and brighter until it became us. It was more like many small fires, some in caves, some near rivers, some in forests, some on islands, each held by a group that knew its own land more deeply than any future observer could. When those fires went out, the world lost not only bodies but whole ways of adapting to Earth. Homo floresiensis and other island traces leave us with a quiet challenge. If even small islands could hold unexpected human stories, how many other branches once lived at the edges of the map, breathed for thousands of years, and disappeared before we learned how to see them? The reason we do not remember those other humans is not because they were unreal, or because their lives were too simple to matter. It is because time is a patient force, and most of what makes a life recognizable cannot survive it. A face disappears quickly. A voice disappears the moment breath stops. A gesture, a warning call, a way of holding a child, a habit of sharing food, a familiar path through grass or stone. All of these belong to living bodies, and living bodies do not cross 100,000 years easily. When we ask why there is no memory of Neanderthals, Denisovans, island humans, and other lost relatives in ordinary human thought, the answer begins with this silence. We did not inherit their stories in the way a family inherits a spoken tale. We inherited only fragments that the earth allowed to remain. This is why the deep origin of humanity feels so strange. It is not only far away, it has been stripped of the details that make people feel close. We can hold a fossil tooth, but not the person's expression, Kay. We can study a stone tool, but not the hand teaching another hand how to strike it. We can identify ancient DNA, but not the voice that once belonged to the body carrying it. Time removes the ordinary human surface first, and leaves behind the hardest parts: bone, stone, ash, and sometimes traces inside the bodies of living descendants. From the viewpoint of Homo sapiens today, this creates an illusion. Because we cannot remember them, we feel as if they were never part of our world. Because their names are modern scientific names, they seem like categories rather than living beings. Because their remains are incomplete, we imagine their lives as incomplete too. But that is only the weakness of preservation, not the measure of their reality. 100,000 years ago, another human lineage did not wake up feeling like a missing chapter. It woke up inside weather, hunger, warmth, fatigue, danger, and group life. It had no reason to know that later humans would fail to remember it clearly. The loss happened slowly, not in their world, but in the long passage between their world and ours. Rivers moved sediment, caves collapsed, bones cracked, scattered or dissolved, camps vanished under soil, coastlines shifted and carried old places beneath the sea. Fires died and left only small changes in earth colour, if anything at all. Even where a human group lived for generations, the signs could be erased by animals, water, roots, frost and time. This matters deeply for the title question, because the Earth that had more than one human species did not leave us a complete archive of itself. It left us a broken edge. The further we go back toward the beginning of our species, the more we are forced to see humanity through absence. We know our ancestors were moving, adapting, meeting changing environments, and sometimes encountering other human relatives, but the spaces between the evidence remain enormous. For Denisovans especially, the gap between life and memory is almost unsettling. A few physical remains and genetic signals opened an entire missing population to science, suggesting that for thousands of years a kind of human could exist across landscapes and yet leave only a faint outline behind. That does not make the Denisovans less important. It makes the silence around them larger. Even Neanderthals, who left far more evidence, are still known through fragments compared with the fullness of their existence. We can speak cautiously about bodies, tools, injuries, habitats, and some behaviours. We cannot recover the private texture of daily life. We cannot know every fear that moved through a group at night, or every kind of trust that held people together through a hard winter. This is not a reason to invent what we do not know. It is a reason to respect the distance. The first thing lost from human history is not always the body. Sometimes it is the continuity of memory. A population may live for tens of thousands of years, adapt beautifully to its land, pass knowledge through generations, and still leave no story that reaches us as a story. It becomes evidence instead. It becomes a layer, a fragment, a trace, a comparison. And in that change from life to evidence, something profound disappears. We are not only looking at extinct human species, we are looking at the remains of worlds whose voices did not survive the crossing into ours. What archaeology gives us from the ancient human world is not the world itself, but the small part that survived being destroyed. This is why the story of more than one human species has to be told with care. A cave floor, a stone tool, a tooth, a piece of skull, a bone with cut marks, a blackened patch of earth where fire once burned. These things can carry real information, but they are not the same as watching a life unfold. They are remains after almost everything else has gone. If a Neanderthal group rested beneath a rock shelter for a season, what could remain after tens of thousands of years? Perhaps a scatter of tools, perhaps animal bones, perhaps a hearth, perhaps nothing clearly recognizable at all. If a Denisovan group moved through a landscape where caves did not preserve bones well, or where later erosion removed old layers, their presence might vanish almost completely. If island humans lived near forests, coastlines, or volcanic ground, much of their world could be altered, buried, washed away, or broken apart before any future eye could study it. The beginning of our species, and the wider world around that beginning, is therefore not a clean record. It is a record with holes so large that the holes themselves become part of the truth. We know ancient humans made and used tools, but stone survives much better than wood, fibre, hide, plant containers, and many kinds of shelter. This means the past can look more stone-centered than it really was. Hands that shaped stone may also have shaped branches, skins, grasses, cords, carrying devices, simple coverings and temporary structures, but softer materials often vanish. A future person might find the stone and miss the rest of the hand's knowledge. The same problem surrounds fire. Fire was central to many human lives, but not every fire leaves a clear sign. Ash scatters. Charcoal breaks down. Later, water or animal movement can disturb a hearth. A place where people warmed themselves, cooked, watched one another in darkness, or kept predators away may become only a faint chemical trace or nothing at all. The body disappears too. Fossilization is rare. Most bodies return to the earth without leaving a readable shape. Bones can be crushed, dissolved, carried away, or mixed with later deposits. Teeth often survive better, which is why a tooth can become strangely important, holding evidence of a life whose face is gone. Ancient DNA is even more fragile. Heat, moisture, time, and soil conditions can destroy it. In some places it survives well enough to transform knowledge. In many others it is lost. This is one reason the map of human origins can change suddenly. A small bone from one cave, a new method applied to an old fragment, or genetic material extracted from sediment can reveal a population that had been invisible before. The Earth did not change at that moment. Our ability to see it changed. That is why the evidence must be treated as both powerful and incomplete. Archaeology can show us that different human species lived, moved, hunted, made tools, used places repeatedly, and sometimes overlapped in time and broad geography. It can show patterns in bodies, injuries, diets, movement, and ancestry, but it cannot preserve every human meaning that once surrounded those actions. A cut mark on bone may tell us an animal was processed. It does not tell us who was hungry that day, who carried the meat, who waited back at the shelter, or whether the group had eaten well the week before. A tool can reveal skill and tradition. It cannot fully reveal the teaching moment, the frustration, the practiced rhythm of the hand, or the quiet pride of doing something well. This matters because the title question is not only about counting species, it is about understanding a lost human world through the small doorway that evidence leaves open. 100,000 years ago, Earth had more than one human species, but the Earth did not keep their lives equally. Some regions preserved bones, others preserved tools, others preserved genetic traces, others preserved almost nothing. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and island humans now appear to us through uneven light. Some are clearer, some are still shadows. All of them remind us that deep history is not silent because nothing happened there. It is silent because nearly everything that happened was made of breath, movement, warmth, fear, memory, and flesh, and those are the first things time takes away. The deepest loss in this story is not only that other human species disappeared, it is that their ways of being alive disappeared with them. A bone can survive after a body is gone. A tool can survive after the hand is gone. A trace of DNA can survive after a population no longer exists as a separate people. But a way of seeing the world is much harder to keep. If Neanderthals knew a valley through generations of cold seasons, if Denisovans moved through highlands or forests with knowledge carried in their groups, if island humans understood the paths, caves, animals, and dangers of a small separated world, most of that knowledge did not cross into the present. It was not written down. It was not carved into a long historical record that we can read. It lived in bodies, voices, habits, memory, and teaching. When those lineages faded, whole forms of human experience faded too. This is difficult to imagine because modern Homo sapiens are the only human species left to do the imagining. We look backward from a lonely position without always noticing that loneliness. We ask what made us different, what made us survive, what made the others vanish. But behind those scientific questions is a quieter human unease. There may have been minds near ours, but not the same as ours, looking at fire, animals, weather, darkness, birth, pain, and death in ways we cannot reconstruct. We should not pretend to know their thoughts in detail. That would be false certainty. Yet it is also too small to treat them as only bones or genetic data. They were living human relatives, and living means more than anatomy. It means attention. It means fear when danger approaches. It means relief when food is found. It means the body learning a place so deeply that survival becomes a form of memory. 100,000 years ago, the human world may have contained several different patterns of such memory. A Neanderthal group in a cold valley might have carried knowledge of stone sources, animal movement, winter shelter, and the cost of injury. A population related to Denisovans may have carried knowledge adapted to landscapes we only partly understand from traces. Island humans may have carried knowledge shaped by isolation, limited resources, and a world smaller in area but complete in meaning. These were not different civilizations in the later sense. They did not leave cities, writing, or monuments that could speak clearly across time, but they may have represented different human relationships with the earth itself. Their bodies, movements, and group traditions were answers to environments that no longer exist in the same way. This brings the story back to the origin of our own species. Homo sapiens did not emerge into a silent world of animals alone. Our ancestors emerged into a wider human family, where other branches had already been shaped by their own long struggles. Some of those branches may have met us, some may have mixed with us, some may have disappeared before any direct contact that we can prove. The loss was not a single door closing, it was many doors closing across time, in different places, under pressures of climate, population, isolation, competition, chance, and change. And when each door closed, the Earth became a little narrower in its human possibilities. This is the feeling that the archaeological record can suggest, but never fully express. A fossil can show that a body existed. A tool can show that hands worked with skill. DNA can show that lineages touched one another. But none of these can fully restore the world from the inside. We cannot ask a Neanderthal elder what mattered most in a hard winter. We cannot ask a Denisovan child what sounds meant safety. We cannot ask an island human how far the known world seemed to reach. Those questions remain open because the living chain that could answer them was broken, and so the disappearance of other human species is not only an event in evolution, it is also a loss of possible human perspectives. The present world contains one surviving human voice speaking for a much wider past. That voice is ours, and it is powerful, inventive, and capable of remembering, but it is also alone in a way our ancestors were not. The more carefully we look into deep time, the more the silence around us changes. It is no longer empty. It becomes crowded with missing lives, missing gestures, missing knowledge, and missing ways of being human that once breathed under the same sky and then passed beyond the reach of memory. To understand why Earth once held more than one human species, we have to look not only at names and fossils, but at bodies. A species is not an idea floating above the land. It is muscle, bone, breath, blood, hunger, heat, fatigue, childhood, injury, and aging, all pressed against a particular environment. Neanderthals show this with unusual force. Their bodies were not simply different from ours in a decorative way. They carried the shape of long adaptation to difficult regions, especially across parts of Europe and Western Asia where cold, seasonal change, and high physical demands were often part of life. Compared with most modern Homo sapiens, Neanderthals tended to have a more robust build. Their skeletons suggest strong limbs, broad bodies, and large joints, a physical pattern that fits a life of intense movement, close-range hunting, uneven ground, and high energy use. This does not mean every day was a dramatic struggle, or that every Neanderthal lived under ice and snow. Their world changed over time. There were warmer periods, colder periods, wooded areas, open landscapes, rocky shelters, rivers, and animal migrations, but their bodies tell us that they were not shaped for a soft or empty world. They were shaped by repeated demands. A strong body can look impressive from a distance, but in deep prehistory, strength was not a luxury. It was a cost and a requirement. Muscle needs food. A broad, powerful frame needs energy. In cold or demanding environments, finding enough calories could become one of the central problems of life. A Neanderthal body may have been well suited to conserving heat and producing force, but that same body also had to be fed through winter, through injury, through failed hunts, through periods when animals moved away or plants were scarce. This gives us a more honest picture of their survival. They were not primitive brutes overpowering nature. They were human relatives living within a narrow balance between ability and need. Their strength helped them, but it also tied them to the daily question of food. Their bodies could endure, but endurance had to be renewed again and again. A cold, adapted body still feels cold when fuel is gone. A powerful hunter can still be wounded. A skilled group can still misread a season. When we bring this back to the origin of Homo sapiens, the contrast becomes important. Our ancestors carried a different body plan, generally lighter, more gracile, with a form that may have favoured long movement, flexibility, and heat management in many environments. Neanderthals show another way the human family could answer the Earth. Their answer was not wrong. It lasted for a very long time. In landscapes where physical force, cold tolerance, and intimate knowledge of terrain mattered, their bodies made sense. A Neanderthal moving across broken ground, carrying stone tools, watching animal tracks, and returning to a shelter with tired muscles was not a failed version of us. That body was a record of generations that had survived before. It was history written into bone. The evidence of injuries in some Neanderthal remains deepens the picture. Many individuals appear to have lived hard physical lives. Some survived serious trauma. This suggests a world where the body was constantly exposed to risk, but also where survival could depend on the group. A badly injured person who lived beyond the immediate wound may have needed others nearby. Again, we must avoid making the evidence say too much. But even cautious interpretation allows one quiet conclusion. Neanderthal life was not only about individual strength, it was about bodies living among other bodies, where knowledge, tolerance, and cooperation could matter as much as muscle. The larger point is that 100,000 years ago, different human species were not just different names on a chart, they were different biological arrangements for staying alive. Neanderthals were one such arrangement, strong and costly, adapted and vulnerable, powerful and dependent on the same fragile systems of food, weather, and group life that touch every human origin story. Their bones remind us that there was more than one way for a human body to meet the Earth, and more than one way for the Earth to shape a human body in return. Homo sapiens carried a different kind of body into the ancient world. It was not better in every simple sense, and it was not protected from hunger, cold, injury, or death. But it seems to have offered another answer to survival, one less centered on heavy physical power and more open to movement, flexibility, heat, endurance, social learning, and the use of tools across changing environments. Compared with Neanderthals, our ancestors were generally more lightly built. Their skeletons were less robust. Their bodies were often better suited to long-distance movement and to managing heat during activity, especially in warmer or more open landscapes. This matters because the origin of Homo sapiens was deeply connected to mobility. Early humans did not live inside one fixed world. They moved through grasslands, woodlands, river edges, coasts, dry regions, and changing climate zones. A body that could travel far, recover, carry children, share food, make use of many resources, and keep moving when one place became harder may have held quiet advantages that were not obvious in a single moment. Neanderthal strength could be powerful in a cold valley. Homo sapiens' flexibility could matter when the valley no longer gave enough. To understand this, we should not imagine our ancestors as fragile modern people suddenly dropped into deep prehistory. They were physically capable, accustomed to walking, carrying, gathering, hunting, digging, making, and enduring discomfort. Their bodies were built by a world without stores, roads, hospitals, lamps, or soft beds. Yet compared with some other human relatives, they were not shaped only for force. They were shaped for range. A lighter body can require less energy to move. Long legs and efficient walking can matter when food, water, and shelter are spread across large distances. Sweating and heat release can matter when activity continues under warm conditions. Hands that make tools can reduce some demands placed directly on teeth, claws that humans never had, or raw muscle. In this way, the Homo sapiens body was never separate from culture. A spear, a blade, a container, a fire, a shelter, a shared memory of a water source, or a teaching gesture could become part of survival as surely as bone and muscle. This is one of the deep shifts in human origins. The body did not have to solve every problem alone. It could lean on objects, on knowledge, on other people, and on habits carried across generations. But that also means Homo sapiens were vulnerable in a different way. A flexible species depends on learning. A child must be taught. A tool tradition must be remembered. A route must be passed on. A group must hold enough knowledge that each generation does not begin again in darkness. If a small population loses too many skilled adults, the body remains alive, but the map inside the group can be damaged. So the lighter body of Homo sapiens was not simply a sign of freedom. It worked best inside social worlds where memory moved between people. This is where biology and culture began to braid tightly together. The hand shaped the tool, but the group preserved the method. The foot crossed the land, but memory guided the direction. The eye watched animals, but older knowledge helped explain what the signs meant. A body that could move widely became more powerful when joined to a mind and a community, able to connect distant places, seasons, and experiences. 100,000 years ago, this did not make Homo sapiens rulers of the earth. It made them one human possibility among others. Their bodies could fail, their groups could disappear, their children could starve. Their movements could end at a desert, a sea, a cold mountain, or a season without food. But the Homo sapiens way of being human contained a kind of openness that would matter more and more over time. It allowed survival to be spread across body, tool, language-like communication, social bonds, and learned environments. In a changing world, that spread may have helped our branch bend where others broke, not because our ancestors were outside nature, but because their bodies were joined to a widening system of memory. The human body of Homo sapiens was not the strongest answer Earth had ever produced. It was a mobile, teachable, cooperative answer, and in deep time, that may have been enough to keep one branch moving when the old world began to close around the others. Island human bodies show how far the human family could be reshaped when a population lived for a long time inside a small and separated world. On a continent, groups may move across wide distances when climate shifts. Animals migrate, or food becomes scarce. They may meet other populations, exchange genes, learn new routes, or follow rivers and coasts into different lands. But an island changes the rules. Water can turn a population inward. Resources may be limited. Large predators may be absent or different. Animals may become larger or smaller over generations. A group may live for thousands of years with fewer outside contacts, surrounded by a landscape that repeats its pressures so steadily that the body begins to carry the island's signature. Homo floresiensis from Flores in Indonesia reminds us of this strange power of isolation. Their small bodies and small brains are not simply curiosities for museums. They are evidence that human evolution did not always move toward the shape we now recognize in ourselves. In some places, under some pressures, a smaller human relative could survive in a way that made sense for that world. This can feel surprising because modern people often imagine evolution as a steady climb toward taller bodies, larger brains, stronger tools, and more familiar faces. But nature does not climb toward us. It works with local pressures, generation after generation. A body that seems unusual from our viewpoint may have been well fitted to its own place. On an island, smaller size can reduce the need for food. In a limited environment, requiring less energy may matter more than becoming larger. If a population is separated for long enough, its path can become very different from its relatives on the mainland. This is not a fantasy version of prehistory. Similar patterns of body size change are known in many island animals. Human relatives were not exempt from ecological pressure simply because they belonged to the human family. The origin of our own species becomes clearer when placed beside this example. Homo sapiens were one branch shaped by mobility, social learning, and broad adaptation. Neanderthals were another branch shaped strongly by cold, physical power and demanding landscapes. Island humans show a third kind of lesson. Place itself can become so powerful that it bends the body into a local answer. For Homo floresiensis, the island was not a small note at the edge of history. It was the whole living world. Its forests, caves, volcanic ground, animals, plants, storms, dry periods, and narrow routes would have formed the conditions of life. A child born there would not have thought of the mainland as a missing centre. The island would have been home, danger, memory, and inheritance all at once. We should be careful not to claim more than the evidence allows. We do not know their full social life. We do not know their voices, beliefs, gestures, or inner world. We cannot say exactly how they understood death, fear, family, or night. But we can say that their remains challenge the simple idea that there was only one proper direction for becoming human. Their existence suggests that human relatives could be small, isolated, skilled enough to survive, and deeply shaped by a world very different from the open landscapes often associated with early Homo sapiens. This matters for the larger question of why Earth had more than one human species. Different environments did not merely place different humans in different backgrounds. They helped produce different human bodies. Cold regions could favor compact strength. Long movement could favor lighter frames and endurance. Islands could favor reduced size and unusual evolutionary paths. Each body was a conversation with place, written slowly through survival and reproduction. When we look at these island humans, we are not looking at a mistake in the human story. We are looking at proof that the human family once had more possible forms than the present world shows. Today there is only one living human body plan left, varied within our species but still belonging to one branch. 100,000 years ago, the wider family could answer Earth in several ways. Some answers were continental, some were hidden in DNA, some were cold adapted, some were island-shaped. And when those island branches faded, the planet lost not only small human bodies, but one of the quietest demonstrations that being human was never a single fixed shape. The world that held more than one human species was not a stable stage. It was a moving climate system, and every human lineage lived inside that motion. 100,000 years ago, the Earth was in the Pleistocene, an age when cold and warmth did not remain fixed for long stretches in the way ordinary human memory can easily grasp. Ice sheets grew and shrank. Sea levels rose and fell. Forests expanded, retreated, and returned in different forms. Grasslands opened where trees had once stood. Wet corridors became dry. Dry regions sometimes softened. Coastlines shifted outward and inward, changing the edges of continents and islands. To a modern person, climate often feels like background, something around human life. In deep prehistory, climate was closer to a slow hand pressing directly on the body, the group, the root, the child, the fire, and the future. For Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other human relatives, survival was never only about intelligence or strength in the abstract. It was about whether a population could remain connected to food, water, shelter, fuel, and one another, while the world itself kept changing shape. A colder phase could open certain habitats and close others. A warmer phase could bring forests back, alter animal movements, and change the places where hunting or gathering made sense. A coastline lowered by trapped ice could reveal land bridges and new routes. Later, rising seas could drown those routes and erase the places where people once walked. In this way, the ancient human map was not drawn once. It was redrawn again and again by ice, rain, dryness, vegetation, animals, and water. This matters because different human species were not spread evenly across the planet like names on a school map. They lived in populations, often small by modern standards, tied to regions where their bodies, tools, and knowledge worked well enough to continue. When climate changed, the question was not simply whether the species was strong. The question was whether enough groups could move, adapt, reconnect, or endure isolation. A valley that had supported generations might become less reliable. A river route might become more important. A shelter that once stood near useful animal paths might lose its value when herds shifted away. A population adapted to one rhythm of seasons could be pushed into another rhythm before its traditions had time to adjust. This is where the origin of our own species becomes part of a larger, more uncertain pattern. Homo sapiens emerged from African landscapes that were themselves changing, not from a single unchanging garden. Our ancestors had to live with movement, variation, and ecological uncertainty from early in their story. That background may have favored flexibility, wider diets, social learning, and the ability to carry knowledge across distance, but it did not make Homo sapiens immune to climate. It only meant that our branch was one of several trying to answer a restless Earth. Neanderthals, with their deep history in Europe and Western Asia, faced repeated climate pressures across long periods. Their strong bodies and regional knowledge helped them survive for a very long time. Yet small and scattered populations could become vulnerable when habitats shifted too severely or too often. Denisovans, still partly hidden from us, may also have lived across varied environments, leaving hints of adaptation in genetic traces. Island humans faced another version of climate and geography, where isolation could protect for a time but also make escape or recovery harder. The same changing Earth that created opportunities also created traps. A land bridge could connect populations, then vanish. A mild period could allow expansion, then a colder period could compress life into refuges. A forest could feed one set of habits, while an open steppe demanded another. Over thousands of generations, these changes shaped not only where humans lived, but what kinds of humans could keep living. The old world of multiple human species was therefore not a museum of fixed forms. It was a weathered, shifting field of experiments, where each lineage carried a different body and a different inheritance into climates that never promised to stay still. When we ask why Earth once had more than one human species, we are also asking how a changing planet divided the human family into separate paths, gave some branches time to grow, pressed others toward the edge, and slowly prepared the conditions in which only one branch would remain. A single valley could decide more than a modern person expects. In ordinary imagination, the fate of a human species sounds enormous, as if it must turn on battles, sudden disasters, or one clear weakness that explains everything. But in deep prehistory, survival often moved through smaller places. A valley with water through a dry season, a cave near animal roots, a river crossing that connected one group to another, a coastline where shellfish, fish, birds, plants, and fresh water could be found at different times of year, a patch of woodland that sheltered animals during cold winds, a grassland that opened movement when forests retreated. These places were not background scenery. They were the living spaces where bodies either continued or failed. For a small human population, the difference between enough and not enough could be local, seasonal, and quiet. If a herd shifted away from one route, a group might have to move farther. If water became unreliable, children, elders, and injured adults would feel the change first. If cold deepened, fuel became more important. If a shelter collapsed or a familiar landscape changed, knowledge inherited over generations could lose some of its power. This is how the changing Pleistocene world pressed on Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, island humans, and other human relatives. It did not press on all of them equally. A group living near a rich coastline might have options that an inland group did not. A population in a cold valley might know stone, animals, and shelters with great skill, yet still be vulnerable if the climate changed the animals' movement. A small island population might survive for a long time within its own world, but if a major environmental shift arrived, there might be nowhere else to go. The origin of Homo sapiens must be understood inside this kind of geography. Our ancestors did not simply carry a successful body into a passive world. They moved through real places that opened and closed. Some routes led to new resources, some led into danger. Some landscapes may have allowed groups to meet, exchange information, and maintain wider connections. Others may have separated groups for long periods, making them smaller, more isolated, and more exposed to chance. This matters because population structure is one of the quiet forces behind the story of multiple human species. A large connected population can sometimes recover after hardship. Knowledge can move between groups. People can find mates beyond a small circle. A new tool method or food habit can spread. But a small isolated population carries more risk. If numbers fall too low, the loss of even a few adults can matter. If children do not survive, the future narrows. If skilled toolmakers, experienced hunters, gatherers, or root keepers die without passing on enough knowledge, the group may remain alive for a while but become less resilient. Deep history does not need a single dramatic blow to change direction. It can turn through repeated small losses, one dry generation, one colder period, one blocked route, one valley empty of animals, one coast drowned by rising water, one group cut off from others for too long. For Neanderthals, landscapes of Europe and Western Asia offered both strength and risk. They knew difficult regions deeply, and that knowledge helped them survive across long stretches of time. But if populations were scattered, climate instability could make reconnection harder. A human branch can be well adapted to a place and still suffer when the place itself changes. For Denisovans, the details are less visible, but the same principle may apply across the wider and more complex regions where their genetic traces point. For island humans, geography could preserve a separate path, yet also make that path fragile. Water can protect a lineage from competition, but it can also trap it inside limits. The larger lesson is that Earth did not merely host different human species, it sorted them through space. It divided them by mountains, deserts, forests, ice, sea, and distance. It gave some groups corridors and gave others walls. It allowed certain populations to expand during one climate phase, then compressed them during another. In that slow sorting, the human family became a set of separate experiments, each tied to the ground beneath it. When we look back 100,000 years, we are not only seeing different human bodies, we are seeing different fates attached to different places, where a valley, a coast, an island, or a changing route could decide whether a branch of humanity kept breathing into another generation. The origin of humanity is often drawn as a line, because lines are easy for the mind to follow. One point comes before another, one ancestor gives way to a later form. One species appears, spreads, improves, and finally becomes us. But the world 100,000 years ago does not fit well inside a line. It looked more like a wide river system, with channels splitting, rejoining, drying out, and opening again after rain. Some branches ran strong for a long time. Some narrowed into isolated pools. Some touched other channels briefly and carried traces away. Some disappeared into ground where no surface water remained. Homo sapiens were one branch inside that shifting system, not the river itself. Neanderthals were another long and powerful branch across much of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans were another, still partly hidden from us, known through fragments and genetic echoes. Island humans show still another possibility, where separation and place could bend the body into unexpected form. When we speak about the beginning of our species, the word beginning can mislead us if it makes us imagine a single clean origin spreading outward without complication. Our beginning was surrounded by other beginnings, older inheritances, separated populations, and human relatives who had their own histories before any encounter with us. This is why climate and geography matter so much. They did not simply create scenery around human evolution, they helped carve the branches. A forest expanding in one region could separate open country groups. A desert growing harsher could close a route that once allowed movement. A cold period could push populations into refuges, where small groups survived in protected pockets. A warmer interval could open new corridors, allowing movement, contact, and mixture. Sea levels could expose land, then drown it again. Islands could hold a human lineage apart long enough for it to become difficult to place in a simple family picture. Across thousands of generations, these changes produced not one human path, but many local histories. Each group carried a body, a tool tradition, a memory of land, and a pattern of survival into its own conditions. The origin of Homo sapiens becomes more truthful when seen inside this wider pattern. Our ancestors came from Africa, but Africa itself was never one simple place. It held deserts, rivers, coasts, highlands, grasslands, woodlands, and regions that changed through time. Different populations of early Homo sapiens may have lived apart, reconnected, moved, adapted, and shared ancestry in complex ways. That means even within our own species, origin was not a single dot on a map. It was a process spread across landscapes and generations. When some Homo sapiens later moved beyond Africa, they entered a world already shaped by other human branches. They did not step into emptiness. They stepped into old human geography. Somewhere in that geography, Neanderthals had long known cold valleys and stone landscapes. Somewhere else, Denisovan-related populations had left traces that would survive more clearly in DNA than in full skeletons. On certain islands, small human relatives may have continued lives almost invisible to the wider world. The human family was therefore not a ladder from lower to higher. It was a population structure spread through space and time. This matters because a branching history changes the emotional meaning of disappearance. If evolution were a ladder, then the loss of other human species might look like the removal of earlier steps once the final step was reached. But if evolution is a branching landscape, their disappearance looks different. It becomes the loss of whole paths that had no obligation to lead to us. Neanderthals did not exist in order to vanish before Homo sapiens. Denisovans did not exist in order to leave a few useful genetic traces. Island humans did not exist in order to surprise modern scientists. Each was part of a living answer to a particular Earth. Each carried a local history that had once been enough to keep bodies alive. The fact that only one branch remains does not make the other branches less real. It makes the surviving branch lonelier. So when we ask why Earth had more than one human species, we are really asking how a changing planet can produce many versions of a close question. How can a human body, a human group, and a human memory endure here? In one place, the answer was strength in cold. In another, hidden ancestry across wide regions. In another, island smallness. In our line, mobility, learning, and widening social memory became increasingly important. None of these answers was permanent. They were all tested by time. And the deep past becomes clearer when we stop searching for a single road to ourselves and begin seeing the human story as a wide, fragile branching of lives, many of which ended before they could ever be remembered by name. When Homo sapiens began to move beyond Africa in ways that would leave lasting descendants, They were not entering an empty human world. This is one of the quiet turns in the story. To modern imagination, migration can look like a line drawn across a map. A group leaves one region, enters another, and slowly spreads into new lands. But in deep prehistory, every movement crossed living landscapes already shaped by animals, seasons, stone, water, and sometimes by other human relatives. For early Homo sapiens, the movement outward was not a single march and not a simple conquest. It was likely made of many pulses, pauses, failures, returns, separations, and new attempts across enormous time. Groups followed possibilities. A wetter corridor might open. A coastline might offer food. A river system might guide movement. A dry region might block it. A population might expand for generations, then shrink when climate changed. In that slow and uneven movement, Homo sapiens eventually entered regions where other human lineages had been living for a very long time. Neanderthals were already established across parts of Europe and Western Asia. Denisovan-related populations were present somewhere across Asia, although their full range remains partly hidden. These were not empty spaces waiting for modern humans. They were old human territories, filled with local knowledge, inherited habits, and bodies shaped by place. Imagine the first edge of such contact, not as a dramatic scene, but as a pressure felt gradually across generations. A group of Homo sapiens moving through a new landscape might notice stone tools they did not make, animal bones broken by other hands, smoke from a distant place, footprints, a used shelter, or the absence of animals where another group had already hunted. The other humans may have noticed them too. They may have watched from far away, avoided them, approached cautiously, or crossed paths without any clear memory reaching us. We do not know the details. We cannot honestly write a single story and call it certain, but the broader pattern is supported by what remains in bones, tools, and DNA. The branches of humanity were not always completely separate. At least some met. This matters because the origin of Homo sapiens was not purified by isolation. Our ancestors became themselves inside a world where boundaries between human groups could be porous at times. Neanderthal ancestry in many people outside Africa today shows that some encounters led to interbreeding. Denisovan ancestry in some present-day populations shows that contact with another hidden human lineage also left biological traces. These genetic signs do not mean that all meetings were peaceful, frequent, or simple. They do not let us imagine one easy story of friendship or war. They only show that at certain times and places, bodies from different human branches came close enough for descendants to carry mixed inheritance forward. That fact changes the emotional shape of the title question. Earth had more than one human species, but those species were not always sealed behind walls. Their histories touched. Their futures, for a while, could become entangled. For a child born from such contact, deep classifications would have meant nothing. The child would not have known the names Homo sapiens, Neanderthal, or Denisovan. The child would have known hunger, warmth, the faces nearby, the sounds of adults, the feel of weather, and the need to belong to a group. Modern science separates lineages to understand them, but life itself may have been messier. Some boundaries were real, bodies differed, populations had separate histories. Yet where ranges overlapped, the ancient world could produce meetings that blurred the edges. This does not make every human lineage the same. It makes their differences more human, because differences existed inside shared vulnerability. All needed food. All needed children to survive. All depended on knowledge moving between generations. All lived under climates that could change without warning. When Homo sapiens met older Eurasian humans, they were not meeting monsters or myths. They were meeting close relatives whose ancestors had taken other roads through time. From the viewpoint of 100,000 years ago, none of these meetings guaranteed that Homo sapiens would become the only surviving human species. They were simply moments in a crowded and uncertain world where one branch from Africa entered landscapes already carrying the footprints of others, and the human family began to touch itself again after long separation. When different human lineages met, the meeting did not have to mean only one thing. Modern minds often reach for simple pictures. Either they fought, or they cooperated. Either one replaced the other, or one learned from the other. Either the encounter was violent, peaceful, rare, or constant. Deep prehistory resists such clean answers. Across thousands of years and many landscapes, contact could have taken many forms. Some groups may have avoided one another. Some may have watched from a distance. Some may have used the same valley in different seasons without standing face to face often. Some may have followed the same animals, searched for the same stone, entered the same shelters, or moved away when signs of another group appeared. Others came close enough for bodies, genes, and futures to mix. The evidence does not allow us to turn every encounter into a story with clear faces and spoken words. But it does allow one careful thought. The ancient human world was not separated into perfect boxes. Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and perhaps other populations moved through overlapping spaces, and where lives overlapped, many kinds of contact became possible. A group entering a landscape already known by another human lineage would have faced practical questions before any symbolic question. Where is water? Where are animals moving? Which caves are safe? Where can stone be found? Which routes are dangerous in cold weather? If another group already used those places, the land itself could become a point of tension or observation. One human group might learn that a shelter was occupied by smell, ash, tools, footprints, or disturbed bones. Another might find a tool style it did not recognize. A distant fire at dusk could mean danger, opportunity, or simply the presence of others who were also trying to survive. This brings us back to the origin of Homo sapiens in a more grounded way. Our ancestors were not abstract explorers moving through an empty map. They were living bodies entering older human spaces, and every space had limits. Food could be shared by the land, but not without cost. Animals could be hunted by more than one group, but too much pressure could matter. Water sources could draw different beings together. A cold period could compress populations into fewer livable regions. In those conditions, conflict is possible, but conflict cannot be the whole story. Avoidance may have been just as important. Quiet separation may have allowed different groups to use nearby landscapes without constant contact. Occasional exchange of knowledge is possible, though difficult to prove in many cases. Interbreeding is strongly suggested by ancient DNA and by the genetic inheritance present in many living people today. That fact alone tells us that at least some meetings crossed the boundary between groups in the most direct biological way. Yet even here, caution matters. Genetic traces do not tell us the emotions of the meetings. They do not say whether a union came from acceptance, capture, alliance, loneliness, necessity, or circumstances we cannot name. They only tell us that the line between human branches was sometimes crossed, and that descendants carried pieces of those crossings forward. This makes the old human world feel both closer and more mysterious. Imagine a child born in such a contact zone. That child would not have understood scientific categories. It would not have carried a label dividing one ancestry from another. It would have learned from the adults nearby, eaten what was given, watched the weather, followed footsteps, and grown inside whatever group accepted and raised it. The body of that child may have held ancestry from more than one human branch, while its daily life belonged simply to survival. This is why the question of more than one human species cannot be told only through separation. It must also include contact. The branches were different, but not always unreachable. They could stand apart for long periods, shaped by their own environments, then meet when climate opened roots or pushed populations together. Some meetings may have ended in fear. Some may have ended in silence. Some left no trace at all. A few left traces still carried inside modern bodies. The ancient world was therefore not only a world of multiple human species, it was a world of moving boundaries where difference, distance, curiosity, pressure, and need could bring close relatives into one another's lives without leaving us a complete story of what happened. Some of the other humans did not vanish from us completely. They vanished as separate peoples, as bodies moving through their own landscapes, as voices inside their own groups, as children born into lineages that no longer continue in visible form. But pieces of them still remain inside many living humans as genetic traces, small inheritances carried silently through thousands of generations. This is one of the strangest facts in the story of human origins. The past is not only under the ground, part of it is inside the body. In many people outside Africa, there are small amounts of Neanderthal ancestry. inherited from ancient meetings between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals after our ancestors moved into Eurasia. In some present-day populations, especially in parts of Oceania, and in varying traces across parts of Asia, Denisovan ancestry also remains. These traces do not turn modern people into half Neanderthals or half Denisovans. They are not simple labels of identity, they are small fragments of deep history, mixed into the wider ancestry of Homo sapiens. But their presence changes the emotional meaning of disappearance. It means that when Neanderthals faded as a distinct population, not every part of their biological story ended at once. Some of their inheritance had already crossed into our branch. When Denisovan-related populations disappeared from view, some of their inheritance had already entered the bodies of people whose descendants would live far into the future. A lineage can die as a separate form and still leave traces in another lineage. That thought is quiet, but it is powerful. It makes extinction less simple and more haunting. The old human world did not end like a door closing cleanly. It blurred. It mixed. It left shadows in blood and cells, long after the faces were gone. When scientists study ancient DNA, they are not merely counting percentages. They are reading faint evidence of contact between human branches that have been separated for long periods. Those contacts may have happened in different places and at different times. Some may have been rare, some may have been local, some may have involved small groups whose names and lives are unrecoverable. The genetic record tells us that the branch is touched, but it does not tell us every story of the touch. It cannot tell us whether two groups met near a river, in a valley, at the edge of a shelter, or after a season of pressure brought them into the same narrow corridor of survival. It cannot tell us what people felt. It cannot tell us who was accepted, who was feared, who was protected, or who was remembered. What it can tell us is that the human family was more connected than the old ladder image allows. The origin of Homo sapiens was not sealed away from other human relatives. Our species carried itself forward through a world where older branches had already lived, adapted, and left biological gifts or burdens that natural selection would later keep, reduce, or reshape. Some inherited variants may have affected how bodies responded to environments, immunity, altitude, skin, or metabolism, though the details are complex and should not be overstated. The larger lesson is simpler and more certain. Our bodies are not pure monuments to a single isolated line. They are records of encounters. This does not reduce Homo sapiens to a mixture without identity. It deepens the identity. It shows that being modern human includes a small memory of those who were not us, yet were close enough to become part of us. 100,000 years ago, Earth had more than one human species, and later, when those species met, the boundaries between them sometimes became living bridges. A child born from such a bridge would not have known that future science would read its ancestry. That child would have known warmth, hunger, touch, sound, and belonging. Yet far beyond that life, through descendants upon descendants, tiny pieces of ancient inheritance could continue. This is why the disappearance of other human species cannot be understood only as absence. Some absence is filled with residue. Some loss leaves an imprint. Somewhere inside the modern human story, beneath language, culture, cities, and memory, there are traces of older human worlds still moving quietly through us. A human lineage can disappear in more than one way. The simplest image is total vanishing. The last body dies, the last child is never born, the last fire cools, and nothing continues. Sometimes deep history may have come close to that kind of ending. Small populations can fall below recovery. A group can be trapped by climate, hunger, disease, isolation, or the steady loss of children until no future remains. But the story of Neanderthals and Denisovan-related peoples asks us to think more carefully. A population can vanish as a separate form and still leave something behind inside another population. It can lose its independent path, its own landscapes, its own generations, its own visible body in the world, and yet some of its inheritance may continue in the descendants of those who once met it. This does not make extinction gentle. It does not restore the lost voices, faces, tools, shelters, or memories. It does not mean Neanderthals still live as Neanderthals, or that Denisovans still live as Denisovans. They do not. But it does mean disappearance is not always a clean erasure. Sometimes it is a fading of form, followed by a thin survival of fragments. When Homo sapiens moved through Eurasia and encountered older human lineages, some boundaries were crossed deeply enough for children to be born with ancestry from more than one branch. Those children belonged to living groups, not to scientific categories. They grew, learned, struggled, and passed on life as any child might. Across time, most of their inheritance became part of the wider Homo sapiens population. Some pieces remained, others were reduced or lost. Natural selection, chance, population size, and generation after generation of mixing changed the pattern. But the important thought is this: the vanished branches were not only buried in the ground. Some small parts entered the long river of our own ancestry. This brings the central question back to the body. 100,000 years ago, Earth had more than one human species, but the borders between those species were not always absolute walls. They were real borders, because the populations had different histories, bodies, and adaptations. Yet they were not so distant that contact could never leave descendants. In this way, the human family was both divided and connected. It had branches, but some branches touched. It had separation, but not perfect isolation. That is why the modern human body can be understood as a kind of quiet archive. It carries the main inheritance of Homo sapiens, but in many people it also carries small signals from ancient relatives who disappeared as independent peoples. These signals should not be exaggerated. They are not a mystical memory. They are not a simple explanation for who a person is. They do not let anyone claim the full life of a lost human lineage, but they do remind us that evolution is made of contact as well as replacement. A bone in a cave tells one kind of story. DNA tells another. Together, they make the ending more complex. Imagine a Neanderthal group near the end of its long history, not knowing it is near the end. Imagine a Denisovan-related population somewhere in Asia, living inside a landscape we still cannot fully reconstruct. Their worlds may have been shrinking, changing, or already fragile. Yet before the separate line disappeared, some inheritance moved across the boundary into Homo sapiens. Later, when the distinct population was gone, those small fragments continued to travel through births, migrations, and generations. The line of bodies ended, but not every trace of the line ended with it. This gives the loss a strange shape. It is both final and unfinished. Final, because the other human species no longer stand beside us, no longer teach their children, no longer adapt to their own lands as themselves. Unfinished, because parts of their biological past still move quietly through the only human species left. To understand this is to see extinction not only as a disappearance from the world, but also as a transformation of what remains. Some human branches did not survive as trees. They survived as small rings inside the wood of another tree. And when we look at ourselves with that knowledge, the present feels less separate from the lost human world, as if our own bodies still carry faint marks of those who walked Earth with us before history had any written memory. The small traces of Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestry in living people should be understood with care, because they can easily be misunderstood. They do not mean that a modern person is partly a different species in any simple or dramatic sense. They do not divide living humans into ancient categories. Another thought. They do not make one person more primitive, more advanced, more mysterious, or more connected to the past than another in a romantic way. All living people today are Homo sapiens. The traces from older human lineages are small fragments within a much larger modern human inheritance, yet small does not mean meaningless. A tiny piece of ancient DNA can carry evidence of a meeting that no story remembered, no song preserved, and no monument marked. It can show that, at some time and in some place, the boundary between two human branches became a living connection. This is why those fragments matter. They are not labels of identity, they are evidence of contact. They remind us that the origin of modern humans was not sealed away inside one pure and separate road. Our ancestors moved through a world that already contained other human relatives, and some of those relatives became part of the biological background that later generations carried forward. To say this honestly, we have to avoid two errors at once. The first error is to exaggerate the traces until they seem like hidden ancient selves inside modern people. That turns science into mythology. The second error is to dismiss them because they are small. That misses the quiet weight of what they reveal. A small fragment can change the shape of the whole story. Before ancient DNA, It was easier to imagine human species as separate branches that simply replaced one another. With genetic evidence, the picture becomes more complicated. Some branches separated, lived apart, adapted to their own lands, and then touched again. When they touched, the result was not always complete separation, and not always complete blending. It could be partial, local, rare, and uneven, but still real enough to leave descendants. This matters for the question of what disappeared when the other human species faded. Their bodies as separate populations disappeared. Their daily lives disappeared. Their voices, tools made of soft materials, gestures, memories, and local knowledge mostly disappeared. But some pieces of their biology entered the long continuity of Homo sapiens. In certain environments, some inherited variants may have been useful, harmful, or neutral. Scientists continue to study these effects carefully, and it would be wrong to reduce them to one simple benefit. Some ancient genetic variants may have interacted with immunity, skin, metabolism, altitude adaptation, or other bodily systems, but each case needs evidence and context. The safer and deeper point is that the modern human body is not a closed museum of one isolated lineage. It is a living record of movement, encounter, survival, and loss. 100,000 years ago, Earth held more than one human species, and later, as some of those branches met Homo sapiens, the body itself became a place where history could cross from one lineage into another. This does not make the old species fully present. A Neanderthal genetic fragment cannot restore a Neanderthal childhood. A Denisovan signal cannot tell us the shape of a family, the sound of a warning, or the meaning of a night beside fire. DNA is powerful, but it is not memory in the human sense. It does not remember as a mind remembers. It only carries biological inheritance, copied across generations with changes, losses, and chance. Still, even that limited inheritance is enough to soften the boundary between us and the vanished human world. It tells us that disappearance was not always pure removal. Sometimes a lineage vanished from the landscape while a faint part of it continued inside another branch. That thought gives the story a quiet moral shape. We are the only human species left, but we are not untouched by those who were here before us. The present human body is mostly the story of Homo sapiens, but in many people it also holds small, silent marks of ancient relatives who once walked under the same sky. They are not enough to make them return. They are enough to remind us that the human past was never as lonely as the present appears. The word disappearance sounds simple until we place it beside the human body. A stone tool can be abandoned, a fire can go out, a shelter can collapse. A population can lose the ability to continue as itself, but when ancestry crosses from one group into another, the meaning of disappearance becomes harder to hold. Did Neanderthals disappear completely if small parts of their inheritance still remain in many people today? Did Denisovan-related populations vanish entirely if traces of them still move through some living bodies? The honest answer is not a clean yes or no. It is a slower answer. They disappeared as distinct human peoples. They no longer occupy valleys, caves, forests, highlands, or cold plains as separate communities. They no longer raise children inside their own lineages. They no longer carry their own local knowledge forward in the full form it once had. In that sense, the loss is real and final, but they did not disappear in the same way a footprint disappears under rain. Some of their biological traces entered Homo sapiens before the separate branches faded. Those traces became part of the only surviving human species, not as living Neanderthals or living Denisovans, but as fragments folded into a larger inheritance. This is why extinction in the human family can feel both complete and incomplete at the same time. The bodies are gone, the worlds are gone, the voices are gone, yet the boundary between gone and remaining is not perfectly sharp. This matters because modern people often imagine survival as a single victory and extinction as a single defeat. Deep human history is quieter than that. A lineage can survive for hundreds of thousands of years, master a landscape, endure cold, hunger, injury, and climate change, and still eventually lose its separate future. Another lineage can continue, but not alone, carrying faint inheritances from those it outlasted. Homo sapiens did not simply stand at the end of the human story untouched. Our branch moved through a world where older human forms had already lived, and in some places those older forms became part of the biological background of future people. To understand this is to see our origin not as purity, but as continuity shaped by contact. A body born today belongs fully to Homo sapiens, yet in many cases it may also carry small molecular signs of meetings that happened before writing, before farming, before memory, before any human knew there would one day be museums or genetics. A person can walk through a modern city with ancient fragments inside their cells, fragments from people who never saw a city, never heard a modern language, and never knew they would become part of a future species' self-understanding. That is not a dramatic fantasy. It is the quiet consequence of descent. But DNA alone cannot carry the whole meaning of a lost people. This is where the question becomes deeper. If a lineage leaves genetic traces but loses its independent life, what exactly has survived? Not the face. Not the language, if there was language in a form we would recognize. Not the full pattern of care, fear, hunting, resting, teaching, or grieving. Not the way a group knew its land. Not the texture of childhood beside another kind of human fire. What survived is much narrower. Biological fragments, copied and reshaped across time. These fragments are precious, but they are not the whole vanished world. So disappearance is not one thing. It has layers. There is the disappearance of bodies from the landscape. There is the disappearance of memory from living tradition. There is the disappearance of culture, gesture, sound, and daily knowledge. And then there is the partial survival of ancestry, small but real, inside another branch. When we ask what it means that Earth once had more than one human species, we are also asking what kind of loss leaves traces behind. Perhaps the most unsettling answer is that some losses are not empty. They remain as faint marks in the survivors. Homo sapiens became the only human species left, but not by passing through a world that left no mark on us. The other humans faded, and yet parts of their deep biological history continued in the bodies of those who remained. To vanish, in human evolution, was sometimes not to become nothing. It was to lose a separate shape, and to remain only as a quiet trace inside another future. The survival of Homo sapiens is often explained too quickly. People want one clear reason, one decisive advantage, one simple sentence that says why we remained while the others disappeared. Some say it was intelligence. Some say it was language. Some say it was better tools, stronger imagination, larger groups, wider cooperation, or a more flexible body. Each of these may hold part of the truth, but none should be treated as a single magic answer. Deep history rarely moves through one cause alone. The survival of our species was more likely shaped by many small advantages, repeated across many generations, in many different environments, under pressures that changed again and again. Homo sapiens did not survive because they stepped outside nature. They survived inside nature with bodies that could still starve, freeze, bleed, become infected, lose children, and fail. Their strength was not invincibility. It was adaptability spread across body, tool, group, memory, and movement. This matters because if we say simply that Homo sapiens was smarter, we flatten the ancient world into a story of winners and losers. Neanderthals were not mindless. Denisovan-related populations were not empty shadows. Island humans were not meaningless mistakes. Each had already survived long enough to prove that their way of being human worked somewhere, for a time. The real question is not whether Homo sapiens had one shining gift that others lacked. The deeper question is whether our branch combined several modest advantages in a way that became powerful under changing conditions. A lighter and more mobile body may have helped groups move across wider regions. A broader diet may have reduced dependence on one kind of food. More connected social networks may have allowed information, tools, and partners to move between groups. Symbolic behavior, if it strengthened identity and communication, may have helped people hold larger worlds in common. Tool-making traditions may have become more varied, allowing groups to solve local problems without waiting for the body itself to evolve. None of these, alone, guarantees survival. Together, over long time, they could change the odds. Imagine two populations facing a difficult climate shift. One is strong and deeply adapted to a familiar region, but smaller and more scattered. The other is also vulnerable, but more connected across distance, more able to move, more able to share methods, and more able to use many kinds of resources. The difference between them may not appear dramatic in one season. Both may suffer, both may lose people, both may retreat. But after many generations, the population with more ways to recover may leave more descendants. This is how deep evolutionary outcomes can emerge without a single dramatic moment. The beginning of Homo sapiens was not a victory parade. It was a long test of resilience. Groups had to preserve knowledge through children. They had to remember water, stone, plants, animals, shelters, and dangers. They had to carry skills across movement. They had to maintain social bonds strong enough to hold people together, but flexible enough to connect beyond the smallest circle. If a tool method improved, it needed to be taught. If a new food source became important, others had to learn it. If a route opened through a changing landscape, the memory of that route had to survive in the group. In this sense, Homo sapiens may have lived increasingly through networks of knowledge. The body remained central, but it was no longer the only place where adaptation happened. Adaptation could live in a tool, a gesture, a shared story, a repeated practice, a pattern of exchange, a memory of seasons, or a relationship between groups. This does not mean Homo sapiens were always peaceful or always wiser. It means their survival may have depended on the ability to distribute risk across many supports. When one food failed, another might be used. When one group suffered, another group might remain connected. When one place changed, movement might be possible. When one generation learned, the next could begin with more than instinct. The mystery of why only one human species remains should therefore be approached without pride. Homo sapiens survived, but survival does not prove moral superiority. It proves that our branch carried a set of traits and circumstances that worked well enough in a world of repeated change. The others faded not necessarily because they were simple, but because their numbers, environments, histories, and vulnerabilities may have left them with fewer ways to recover when the pressure became too great. The answer is not a throne. It is a fragile accumulation. A group does not survive only because one person knows something. It survives when knowledge can move from one body to another, from one camp to another, from one generation to the next. This may have been one of the quiet strengths of Homo sapiens. A skill held by a single adult is fragile. If that adult dies in a hunt, during childbirth, from infection, hunger, or accident, the skill may die too. But a skill held by many people, repeated, taught, corrected, and carried across distance, becomes more durable than any one life. In deep prehistory, this kind of durability could matter as much as strong bones or sharp stone. A group that knew many food sources, many routes, many tool methods, and many seasonal patterns did not have to face each problem with the body alone. It could face the problem with memory spread across the group. When we think about why Homo sapiens survived while other human lineages faded, population structure becomes important. Larger or more connected groups can hold more information. They can lose individuals without losing every skill. They can exchange partners, reduce isolation, and recover more easily after hardship. They can notice what another group has learned and slowly bring that knowledge into their own lives. This does not mean Homo sapiens were always living in large villages. They were not farmers yet. They were mobile foragers in changing environments. But even mobile groups can be connected through kinship, seasonal meetings, shared territories, exchange, mating networks, and remembered routes. The important point is not crowd size in a modern sense. It is connection. A small group completely cut off from others carries danger inside its isolation. If children die, if adults are injured, if knowledge is lost, if mates become scarce, the future narrows. A connected group has more openings. Someone may know another path. Someone may have seen animals return to a distant valley. Someone may carry a better way of shaping stone, repairing a tool, preparing food, making shelter, or reading a landscape. Over many generations, these small transfers can become a hidden advantage. The origin of Homo sapiens is closely tied to this ability to live through shared learning. Our bodies were not the most powerful bodies in the human family, but our branch may have become especially strong at building survival outside the individual body. The hand made a tool, but the method lived in the group. The feet crossed distance, but the root lived in memory. The mouth communicated, but the meaning lived between people. A child did not have to rediscover the world alone. It entered a web of instruction, watching, correction, imitation, and repeated practice. That web allowed each generation to begin with what earlier generations had already tested. In a stable world, this might matter slowly. In an unstable world, it could matter greatly. Climate changed. Animals moved. Water sources shifted. Cold returned. Forests opened or closed. When conditions changed, a population with more ways to learn and reconnect might adjust before the damage became fatal. A population that was smaller, more isolated, or more tied to one region might still be highly skilled, but less able to recover if its local world changed too sharply. This may have been part of the pressure on Neanderthals near the end of their history. They were capable, adapted, and deeply experienced in their landscapes, yet if their groups were scattered and numbers were low, the loss of connection could become dangerous. Denisovan-related populations remain harder to describe, but the same broad principle applies to any ancient human branch. A lineage does not survive only through ability. It survives through enough bodies, enough children, enough links, and enough continuity to carry ability forward. This is where survival becomes less dramatic and more sobering. Homo sapiens may have endured not because every individual was wiser, but because the species increasingly lived through networks that made knowledge harder to erase. One person could die, but the method remained. One camp could fail, but another still knew the route. One valley could empty, but memory pointed elsewhere. Over thousands of years, that difference could slowly widen. It would not look like a sudden victory. It would look like one branch recovering more often than others after the same world wounded them all. The survival of Homo sapiens may have depended on no single miracle, but on the slow joining of many small advantages. A lighter body could travel more easily, but travel alone was not enough. A flexible diet could reduce risk, but food still had to be found, processed, shared, and remembered. Better tools could help, but tools only mattered when the knowledge of making them passed from hand to hand. Wider social networks could connect groups, but connection depended on trust, communication, movement, and repeated contact across seasons. This is why the story of Homo sapiens should not be told as if one trait rose above all others and conquered the ancient world. It was more likely a braided survival system. Body, mind, tool, group, memory, and landscape worked together. When one support weakened, another might help carry the weight. A group facing hunger might survive because it knew several kinds of food. A group entering a colder region might survive because it could make better coverings, use shelters more carefully, or maintain fire more reliably. A group losing members might survive because it remained connected to others. A group moving into strange land might survive because it could learn quickly, imitate, teach, and adjust. None of these abilities made life easy. They simply gave Homo sapiens more ways to continue when conditions changed. This is important because the other human species did not disappear, because they lacked all intelligence, all care, or all skill. Neanderthals survived for a very long time in demanding environments. Denisovan-related populations left traces across a wide and complex human past. Island humans endured in isolated worlds where their bodies made sense under local pressure. Each of these branches had already proven its ability to live. The difference may have been that Homo sapiens carried a wider combination of recoveries. Deep history does not always reward the strongest body or the most specialized adaptation. Sometimes it favors the lineage that can shift when the old answer stops working. A cold-adapted body may thrive in one rhythm of climate, then face difficulty when habitats fragment or prey changes. An island population may live well in isolation, then become vulnerable when the island's conditions shift. A small, scattered population may hold great knowledge, yet lose too much when groups become separated and numbers fall. Homo sapiens were also vulnerable to all of this, but a growing ability to move information, tools, partners, and habits across wider networks may have given our branch more chances to recover. The origin of our species, then, was not only in anatomy, it was in continuity. A human body could die, but a method could remain. A camp could fail, but a route could be remembered elsewhere. A season could be harsh, but shared knowledge could help people prepare for the next one. Over many generations, these small continuities could accumulate into something powerful. Not power in the heroic sense, but power in the statistical sense. More children surviving, more groups reconnecting, more skills preserved, more chances for a population to rebound after pressure. This is a quiet kind of victory, and perhaps that is why it is easy to miss. It does not look like a single battle between species. It looks like thousands of small differences spread across time. One group finds food when another cannot. One network survives a cold period. One tool tradition spreads. One route stays known. One child grows to adulthood and carries knowledge forward. Slowly, the balance changes. The world that once held many human species begins to narrow. Some branches fade in place. Some mix into others. Some vanish almost completely from the record. Homo sapiens remain, but not because the ending was written from the beginning. Our survival was the result of fragile advantages meeting fragile circumstances again and again, until the branch that might have failed became the branch that was still here to ask what happened to the rest. Near the end of the Neanderthal story, the world did not suddenly become empty. There was no single moment when every Neanderthal fire went out at once, no clear line in the soil where a whole people vanished in one breath. Their disappearance seems to have been slower, more uneven, and more difficult to imagine. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had lived across parts of Europe and Western Asia. They had endured cold phases, warmer intervals, shifting animals, changing forests, open steppe, caves, rivers, injuries, hunger, and the demands of small group life. Their history was far longer than the history of farming, cities, writing, or states. When we say they disappeared around 40,000 years ago, we are speaking from a modern distance that compresses immense human experience into a simple phrase. For them, there was no label called disappearance. There were only seasons becoming harder, groups becoming smaller, familiar places changing, encounters with Homo sapiens, children who survived or did not, and knowledge that either passed forward or stopped with the people who carried it. This matters because the end of Neanderthals should not be imagined as the fall of a weak species before a powerful one in a single dramatic scene. It was likely a long narrowing. Some groups may have remained in certain regions after others were already gone. Some may have mixed with incoming Homo sapiens populations. Some may have retreated into smaller ranges as climate, food, and population pressure changed around them. Some may have simply become too few and too isolated to recover from ordinary losses. In small populations, ordinary losses are not small. The death of experienced adults can remove knowledge of roots, stone sources, animal movement, and winter shelters. The loss of children can close the future quietly. A few difficult generations can reduce a group until there are not enough people, enough mates, enough teachers, or enough connections to continue as before. This is one of the colder truths in human origins. Extinction does not always arrive as catastrophe. Sometimes it arrives as reduced possibility. Neanderthals were not strangers to difficulty. Their bodies and tools show long adaptation to demanding landscapes. Their survival across so much time tells us they were capable human relatives, not failed experiments. But long survival in the past does not guarantee survival forever. A lineage can endure many climate cycles and still meet a set of pressures that slowly exceeds its ability to recover. By the time Homo sapiens were spreading more widely through Eurasia, Neanderthal populations may already have been under strain in some places. Climate instability, fragmented habitats, low population density, and competition or contact with Homo sapiens could all have played roles. It would be dishonest to reduce this to one simple cause. The evidence points toward a complex ending, shaped by environment, population, chance, and encounter. Our own species was part of that ending, but not necessarily as a single army replacing another humankind. More likely, Homo sapiens entered landscapes where Neanderthals had lived for a very long time, and over many generations the balance of numbers, networks, movement, and recovery shifted. Some Neanderthal ancestry entered modern humans. That means some meetings were close enough to leave descendants. Yet the Neanderthals as a separate population still faded. Their bodies stopped appearing in the living world. Their local knowledge stopped moving through Neanderthal children. Their way of being human lost its own continuous path. From the viewpoint of the title question, their disappearance marks one of the great narrowings of Earth's human diversity. 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals were part of the breathing human world. They were not a memory, not an exhibit, not an ancient name. They were people of their own branch, waking into weather, using fire, shaping stone, watching animals, caring enough for some injured bodies to survive, and carrying histories older than ours in parts of Eurasia. Around 40,000 years ago, that branch was no longer visible as itself. The planet did not notice in the way a person notices loss. Rivers kept moving. Seasons kept turning. Animals kept crossing the land. Homo sapiens continued. But somewhere in that long transition, one of Earth's other human answers became silent. On islands, the end of a human lineage can feel especially quiet, because the world that holds it is smaller. A continent can offer many directions. A group may move north, south, inland, toward rivers, toward coasts, or into valleys where climate has left some refuge. Other groups may be close enough to reconnect with. New mates, new knowledge, or new routes may remain possible. But an island is different. Its edges are water. Its resources are limited by its size. Its animals, plants, caves, streams, and coastlines form a world that may be rich for a time, but not endlessly forgiving. If conditions shift too far, a small island population may have fewer exits than a continental population. This is why island humans matter so deeply in the story of Earth's lost human diversity. Homo floresiensis on Flores shows that a human relative could live for a long time in a separated world, shaped by the island's pressures, perhaps protected by distance from some outside changes, yet also made fragile by that same separation. Their small bodies suggest that the island had become part of their biology. It did not merely surround them. It entered the long pattern of generations. A smaller body can make sense where food is limited and isolation lasts long enough. The body becomes an answer to the island. But when an answer is deeply tied to one place, the fate of that place becomes more important. A volcanic event, a climate shift, a change in available animals, a disturbance to water or vegetation, a new arrival, or a long period of ecological stress could matter greatly. We should not claim one certain cause for the disappearance of Homo floresiensis, because the evidence does not allow a simple final scene, but we can understand the general danger. A small population in a limited landscape can be resilient for thousands of years and still be vulnerable to a change that would be less final somewhere else. The same pattern may apply to other island or isolated human relatives whose evidence is still debated, fragmentary, or incomplete. Islands preserve strange evolutionary paths, but they can also hide the end of those paths. A group can live almost entirely outside the awareness of distant humans. It can develop its own rhythms of food, movement, shelter, danger, and memory. It can raise generations who know the island not as a prison, but as the full shape of home. Then, if the conditions that held that life together begin to fail, the loss may leave only a small number of bones, tools, or cave deposits for the future to interpret. This returns us to the origin of Homo sapiens from another angle. Our ancestors were often mobile across wider connected landscapes, though they too could face isolation and danger. Their survival increasingly depended on movement, networks, learning, and the ability to enter new regions. Island humans show another human possibility: survival through deep local belonging. Their world may have been smaller in space, but not smaller in meaning. A child on Flores did not live in a footnote. The island's sounds, paths, animals, storms, dry seasons, and shelters were the complete horizon of life. When we call such people small-bodied or island-adapted, we are using scientific language from far away. For them, being human was not measured against us. It was measured against whether the group found food, kept children alive, avoided danger, and carried knowledge into the next season. The tragedy of isolated lineages is that their success can become narrow. The very separation that lets a branch become distinct can reduce its ability to recover when pressure arrives. A continent may wound a population and still leave many places to retreat. An island may wound a population and leave only the same coast, the same hills, the same caves, the same limited food web. When we ask why Earth once had more than one human species but does not now, Island humans remind us that disappearance did not always happen in the center of the map. Sometimes it happened at the edges, in small worlds surrounded by water, where a human branch could live long enough to become profoundly different, then fade almost beyond sight before the larger human story even knew it had been there. The disappearance of other human species is often imagined too dramatically, as if deep history must have ended with one final confrontation, one last refuge, one day when the old human world gave way to ours. But the evidence points towards something quieter and perhaps more difficult to accept. The narrowing of humanity probably happened unevenly, across many places, over many generations, through pressures that did not always look like endings to those who lived inside them. A Neanderthal group might have survived in one region while another had already vanished. A small island population might have continued its own life, while large continents were changing elsewhere. Denisovan-related peoples may have left traces across a wide geography, yet their final histories remain hidden behind fragments of bone and DNA. The old human world did not disappear like a city burning in one night. It withdrew from the map slowly, in patches, leaving some traces visible, others almost erased. This is important because it keeps the story honest. Homo sapiens did not wake one morning as the only humans on Earth because every other branch had fallen at once. The shift was longer, stranger, and more uneven than that. In some places, climate may have made life harder. In others, population size may have become too small. Somewhere, contact with Homo sapiens may have changed the balance of food, territory, mates, disease, or inherited knowledge. Somewhere else, an isolated group may simply have reached a point where ordinary losses could no longer be repaired. A child not born, an elder dying before teaching a route, a group losing contact with another group, a shelter no longer useful, animals no longer returning to the same ground. These are not the scenes people usually imagine when they think of extinction. Yet, in small populations, such quiet changes can carry enormous weight. A lineage can disappear not because it suddenly fails at being alive, but because the margin around life becomes thinner each generation. When we return to the origin of Homo sapiens, this slow withdrawal changes the meaning of our survival. It does not look like a clean replacement of darkness by light. It looks more like one branch remaining connected while other branches became smaller, scattered, mixed, or isolated beyond recovery. Our ancestors may have had advantages in movement, social networks, flexible tools, and shared knowledge, but those advantages worked across time rather than in one simple moment. They allowed some groups to recover when pressured, to move when landscapes changed, to reconnect when numbers fell, and to preserve skills across wider circles. Meanwhile, other human branches may have found themselves increasingly limited by smaller populations, narrower ranges, or environments changing faster than their traditions could answer. This does not make their lives lesser. It makes their ending more human. They were not symbols of failure. They were populations living through difficult worlds until the chain of continuation broke. The archaeological record reflects this uneven fading. There are no complete farewell letters from Neanderthals, no final Denisovan story, no island voice telling us when the last child of a lineage stopped being born. We receive dates, layers, tools, bones, sediments, and genetic signals. These show patterns, but not the full emotional reality. From our side of time, we call it extinction. From inside the process, it may have felt like hunger, movement, absence, fewer relatives, longer distances, unfamiliar people, changing animals, and places that no longer gave what they once gave. The map of Earth became less crowded with human possibilities, but no one living then could see the full map. That is the quiet sadness of it. The old branches did not know they were branches in a future diagram. They were families, groups, bodies, and memories trying to continue. One by one, in different regions and under different pressures, their separate continuities ended. Homo sapiens remained, but we remained in a world that had lost something larger than a few names. It had lost other human ways of enduring cold, island isolation, hidden Asian landscapes, stone valleys, animal routes, and nights beside fires that were not ours. The disappearance was not a single dramatic collapse. It was the slow retreat of many human forms from the living Earth, until the planet that once held several answers to being human was left with only one voice asking where the others went. When only Homo sapiens remained, the Earth did not become empty of life. Forests still grew, rivers still moved, animals still migrated, hunted, nested, hid, and died. Ice still formed and melted, storms still crossed the land, but something quiet had changed in the human world. The planet had lost the wider human diversity it once carried. There was no longer a Neanderthal way of enduring cold valleys, no longer a Denisovan-related human presence moving through landscapes still partly hidden from us, no longer the small-bodied island humans whose forms showed what isolation could do to a branch of our family. The word human, which had once pointed towards several living answers, slowly narrowed until it pointed only to us. This is difficult to feel, because we were born after the narrowing. We have never stepped outside at night and wondered whether another kind of human watched a different fire beyond the ridge. We have never crossed a valley knowing that a close human relative, not simply another tribe of Homo sapiens, may have left tools near the same water. We have never shared the earth with a second living human species whose body, face, and deep ancestry were not quite ours. Because we have never known that world, we easily mistake the present for the natural state of things. But from the viewpoint of deep time, the present is unusual. For a long period, the human family was plural. It held several branches alive at once. Then, through climate, population changes, isolation, contact, interbreeding, and disappearance, that plurality faded. Homo sapiens became alone, not because loneliness was the original plan, but because other lines ended or were absorbed into ours. The cost of this is not only scientific, it is imaginative, emotional, and educational. If another human species were alive today, even in a small number, our understanding of ourselves would be different. We could not so easily place Homo sapiens at the unquestioned center of the human story. We would see with living eyes that intelligence, social life, tool use, care, adaptation, and memory can take more than one human form. We would know that our way of being human is not the only possible answer nature ever produced. But because the others are gone, the burden of interpretation falls on fossils, tools, DNA, and humility. The origin of our own species becomes harder to understand honestly when we are the only ones left to tell it. Survivors often mistake survival for destiny. They look back and imagine that their existence explains everything. Homo sapiens can do the same. We can look at our cities, languages, machines, art, and science, then imagine that deep history was always moving toward this outcome. But the vanished human species warn against that kind of pride. Neanderthals survived for an immense span of time before disappearing. Denisovan-related peoples left genetic traces that show the past was wider than their bones reveal. Island humans survived in worlds that made sense locally, even if they surprise us now. Each of these lineages tells us that survival is not the same as superiority in every dimension. It is the result of traits meeting circumstances, numbers meeting environment, and chance meeting time. When Homo sapiens became the only human species, we inherited more than the earth. We inherited the silence of the others. Their absence can make us feel larger than we are. It can make us forget that our branch, too, was once fragile, local, and uncertain. It can make the human story look like a pyramid with us at the top, instead of a tree with many missing branches. To remember them is to reduce that illusion. It reminds us that the living human world is narrower than the ancient one. It reminds us that our bodies carry not only victory, but also the marks of a long narrowing. The planet once tested several human possibilities. Only one remains to ask what the test meant. And in that question there is a quiet responsibility. To understand our survival without turning it into arrogance, and to look at the lost branches not as failures, but as real human answers that once shared the earth with us. Modern humans often stand at the center of their own story because there is no one left nearby to move us from that center. Every living human face belongs to Homo sapiens. Every living language is carried by Homo sapiens. Every grave, city, road, field, machine, painting, song, memory, and scientific question now comes from one surviving human branch. This makes our position feel natural, almost obvious. We look backward and see ourselves at the end of the road, then slowly begin to believe the road existed for us. But deep time asks for a different kind of humility. The human story was not always a road with one traveller. It was a forest of related branches, and many of those branches are now missing. Homo sapiens are not the whole tree. We are the branch that still has leaves. That difference matters. A surviving branch can grow so large in its own mind that it forgets the broken limbs around it. It can mistake silence for emptiness. It can mistake absence for proof that the absent ones were unimportant. It can mistake its own continuation for the purpose of the entire past. But the evidence from Neanderthals, Denisovans, island humans, and other ancient relatives makes that pride harder to keep. Their bones, tools, injuries, adaptations, and genetic traces show that the world once held human lives that were not ours, yet were close enough to disturb any simple idea of uniqueness. They were not merely background to our rise, they were parallel histories, shaped by their own environments, carrying their own forms of knowledge, and meeting the same earth through different bodies. When we understand this, Homo sapiens begin to look less like the planned centre of nature and more like the remaining witness of a much wider experiment. This does not reduce our importance, it deepens it. To be the only human species left is not only to be successful, it is to be alone with the responsibility of memory. We are the ones who can study the bones, read the DNA, protect the sites, correct old mistakes, and speak carefully about those who cannot answer back. The origin of our species becomes more honest when we admit that we came from a crowded and uncertain family. Our ancestors did not step from darkness into destiny. They were one population among others, vulnerable to climate, hunger, disease, isolation, and chance. They survived, but survival did not erase the dignity of the branches that did not. A Neanderthal child learning a landscape was not less real because no Neanderthal descendants now sit beside us as a separate people. A Denisovan-related group, crossing a region we still cannot fully map, was not less human because its bones are rare. An island human walking through a small world was not less meaningful because the island looked tiny from a modern map. Each belonged to its own present. Each carried a full life from the inside. From our side of history, they appear incomplete because the record is incomplete. From their side, they were not incomplete at all. This is the quiet correction deep history gives us. It shifts the focus away from our greatness alone and toward our fragility, our contingency, and our inheritance. Homo sapiens survived through a combination of body, tool, movement, social memory, and chance. We did not survive because the universe needed us in advance. We survived because, across enough generations, our branch kept finding ways to continue. The others, under different pressures, did not continue as separate forms. That fact should make us thoughtful, not proud in a shallow way. It should remind us that being human is not a prize handed to the strongest branch. It is a condition shaped by time, environment, dependence, and loss. The present human world can feel enormous because our species has spread everywhere. Yet compared with the ancient human family, it is also narrow. There are billions of us, but only one kind of us. The number is vast while the diversity is gone, and when we look at the deep past with that in mind, we begin to see ourselves differently. We are not the owners of human history. We are its remaining voice, speaking from the edge of a forest that once had more branches than memory can restore. The loneliness of Homo sapiens is easy to miss because it is surrounded by noise. There are cities, families, languages, screens, roads, farms, stories, arguments, music, and billions of human voices speaking at once. From inside that crowd, it may sound strange to call our species alone. Yet, in the deeper sense, we are alone in a way our ancestors were not. The ancient Earth once held more than one human form, more than one branch close enough to us to share ancestry, sometimes to meet, sometimes even to leave descendants through contact. Today, there is no other human species living beyond the mountain, across the river, on an island, or in a cold valley. There is no second kind of human fire in the distance. There is only us, varied within our species, spread across the planet but still one surviving line. This solitude is not a feeling that appeared suddenly in modern minds. It is the result of a long evolutionary narrowing. Climate shifted, populations separated. Some groups became small, some mixed into others, some lost the ability to recover. Some island worlds became too fragile, some cold-adapted histories ended. Across tens of thousands of years, the human family changed from many living branches into one. The silence around us was made slowly. It was made by ice and warmth, by hunger and movement, by children born and not born, by roots opening and closing, by encounters that left DNA and encounters that left nothing, by the ordinary pressure of time on small populations. This is why the story of more than one human species should not be treated only as a curiosity about the past. It changes how we understand the present. Homo sapiens did not become alone because we were chosen outside nature. We became alone because nature is full of endings. Every branch, including ours, is vulnerable to conditions larger than itself. The difference is that our branch continued while the others faded. That continuation gave us the power to name the lost ones, but it also gave us the risk of misunderstanding them. When only one voice remains, that voice can begin to sound like the only voice that ever mattered. Deep history corrects this. It tells us that Neanderthals were not crude shadows. Denisovans were not just a genetic puzzle. Island humans were not jokes of evolution or mistakes at the edge of the map. They were different human answers to different worlds. Their disappearance left Homo sapiens with a vast inheritance and a vast absence. We inherited the Earth as the only humans left, but we also inherited the empty spaces where other human possibilities once stood. To feel that clearly is not to weaken our sense of humanity. It makes it more serious. It asks us to hold our survival with humility. Our bodies contain the main story of Homo sapiens, but in many people they also carry small traces of older human meetings. Our minds can study what was lost, but they cannot fully restore it. Our science can recover fragments, dates, bones, tools, sediments, and DNA, but it cannot bring back the living worlds behind them. The loneliness of Homo sapiens is therefore both biological and historical. Biological, because no other human species remains beside us. Historical, because we are surrounded by evidence of lives we can never completely know. The more carefully we look, the less empty the silence becomes. It fills with vanished bodies, lost children, injured adults who are helped or not helped, groups moving through cold valleys, unknown people crossing Asian landscapes, island families living inside worlds bounded by water, and ancient fires whose warmth never reached written memory. We are alone now, but the path to this loneliness was crowded. That is the quiet paradox. The present contains one human species, yet the past contains many human presences. To understand ourselves honestly, we have to hold both truths at once. We are the last surviving branch, and we are also the branch that grew out of a forest of others. Our solitude is not emptiness. It is the echo left after a wider human world disappeared. To come near the end of this story, we have to return to the beginning with a quieter mind. 100,000 years ago, Earth had more than one human species, and that fact changes the shape of everything that follows. It means the human past was not a lonely road leading only to us. It was a wider field of lives, bodies, experiments, separations, meetings, and losses. Homo sapiens were already part of the world, but not the whole human world. Neanderthals carried their strong bodies through cold and shifting Eurasian landscapes. Denisovan-related peoples left a presence that is still partly hidden, yet real enough to remain in DNA. Island humans, such as Homo floresiensis, remind us that isolation could bend the human form into shapes that modern expectation would not predict. Each branch had its own relationship with Earth. Each met hunger, weather, danger, childhood, injury, aging, and death through a body shaped by its own long inheritance. The story is not only about fossils. Fossils are the doorway, not the full room. A skull fragment, a tooth, a stone tool, a hearth, a cave layer, a genetic signal. These are what remain after almost everything soft has disappeared. Behind each trace was once a living world. Someone carried food. Someone watched the sky change. Someone felt cold in the body. Someone followed an older person who knew where water might still be found. Someone learned where stone broke well. Someone slept close to others because darkness was not empty. We cannot restore those lives fully, and we should not pretend we can, but we can give them a more honest place in the story of ourselves. They were not failed attempts at being us. They were human relatives living inside their own present. When we understand this, the disappearance of the other human species becomes more than a scientific fact. It becomes a lesson in humility. Evolution did not write a straight sentence ending with modern people. It wrote many lines at once, some crossing, some breaking, some fading before they could be read clearly. Homo sapiens survived, but our survival was not guaranteed from the start. It came through a long mixture of movement, flexible bodies, tools, social memory, cooperation, chance, population structure, and changing environments. In another climate pattern, in another geography, with another sequence of losses and recoveries, the living human world might have looked different. That possibility does not weaken the value of our species. It makes our existence feel more fragile and more precious. We are not standing at the top of a simple ladder. We are standing at the edge of a deep forest where most of the branches are gone. The educational value of this story is not only to know ancient names. It is to learn how carefully life depends on conditions. A strong body can still be vulnerable if food disappears. A skilled population can still fade if numbers fall too low. An island can protect a lineage, and also trap it. A cold valley can shape a body, and later become part of its danger. A species can vanish as a separate people, yet leave faint traces inside another branch. The human story teaches that survival is not pure superiority. It is relationship between body and land, group and memory, chance and time. And perhaps that is why this subject belongs so well to a quiet night. It lowers our pride without taking away wonder. It reminds us that being human is not a possession held only by the present. It is an inheritance shaped by many who came before, including those who no longer have voices. We are the ones left to remember them, not because we are better in every way, but because we remain. And remaining gives us a responsibility to speak carefully, to avoid false certainty, and to see our own humanity as part of a much older, wider, and more fragile story. The value of this story is not that it makes the past feel stranger for a moment, then lets us return unchanged. Its value is that it teaches a slower and more truthful way to think about being human. Modern people often inherit a simple picture without noticing it. We imagine evolution as a long staircase, with small, dim figures below, and ourselves standing at the bright top. We imagine that the past was unfinished because it did not yet look like the present. But the world of 100,000 years ago corrects that picture. Evolution was not walking toward us with certainty. It was testing many forms of life under many pressures. It gave the human family more than one body, more than one range, more than one kind of adaptation, and more than one chance to continue. Some branches carried powerful bodies into cold regions. Some left hidden genetic signs across wide landscapes. Some were shaped by islands until their bodies became local answers to local worlds. Our branch, Homo sapiens, survived through its own changing mixture of movement, social learning, tools, memory, communication, and chance. None of this means that evolution had a final goal waiting in advance. It means that life changes through conditions, and conditions are never still. This is one of the most useful lessons the deep past can give. A living thing does not survive only because it is strong in a general way. It survives because its strengths fit a world long enough to leave descendants. When the world changes, yesterday's strength can become less certain. A body suited to cold may struggle when habitats fragment. A small island population may endure for thousands of years, then face a pressure it cannot escape. A scattered lineage may know its land deeply, yet lose resilience if groups become too few and too isolated. Homo sapiens also could have failed. Our ancestors were not protected by destiny. They were bodies in weather, families under pressure, children at risk, groups needing food, warmth, and knowledge. Their survival teaches not pride, but dependence. We depended on one another. We depended on memory moving between generations. We depended on tools, fire, roots, water, plants, animals, and the ability to adjust when old habits stopped working. That lesson still has meaning, even though the modern world looks so different from the Pleistocene. It reminds us that human life is never carried by the individual alone. It is carried by connections. A person lives inside a web of knowledge, learned from others. A community survives by preserving what matters and changing what must change. A species continues only while bodies, environments, and social memory remain in workable relationship. The vanished human species show what happens when that relationship breaks beyond repair. They were not lesser because they disappeared. They were vulnerable because all life is vulnerable. This can make the listener's sense of humanity gentler. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate from nature, we can see ourselves as one outcome of nature's long uncertainty. Instead of seeing ancient relatives as crude shadows, we can see them as lost human answers, each real within its own world. Instead of treating survival as proof of absolute superiority, we can treat it as a reason to be careful with the life that remains. The fact that Homo sapiens are the only human species left should not make us careless. It should make us more attentive. We are the branch that can look back, but looking back should teach restraint. We should not fill gaps with fantasy. We should not turn fragments into false certainty. We should let evidence speak where it can, and let silence remain where evidence ends. In that way, this story becomes more than prehistory. It becomes a quiet education in humility. The Earth once held several ways of being human. Most are gone. We cannot bring them back. But by understanding that they existed, we can loosen the narrowness of the present and remember that humanity was once wider than the single surviving voice that now tells the story. And now, when the story reaches its final quiet place, we are left with a truth that is simple to say and difficult to fully feel. Homo sapiens are the only human species left. Around us, the world is full of human presence, but not human variety in the ancient sense. Every living child belongs to our branch. Every old face, every hand, every spoken language, every memory carried in a family, every question asked under a night sky now comes from one surviving line. Yet deep beneath this present world, the older Earth was different. It held Neanderthals in cold and changing landscapes. It held Denisovan-related peoples whose traces still rise faintly through DNA. It held island humans whose small bodies remind us that isolation can shape a human relative in unexpected ways. It may have held other branches still only partly understood, their evidence hidden, lost, or not yet recognized. For a long time, being human was not a single condition. It was a family of possibilities spread across space, climate, hunger, movement, and time. Some possibilities were powerful and robust. Some were hidden and fragmentary. Some were local and island-shaped. Some met our ancestors and left small traces inside the bodies of living people. Others may have vanished without leaving anything we can read. This is where the story becomes more than a record of extinction. It becomes a mirror. We are not only asking what happened to them, we are asking what their absence teaches us about ourselves. It teaches that survival is never a simple crown. It teaches that intelligence, strength, tools, and adaptation always depend on conditions. It teaches that a lineage can endure for an immense span of time and still disappear when climate, population, isolation, chance, and contact turn against it. It teaches that the present is not the full measure of the past. Homo sapiens survived, but we survived out of a wider human world, not above it. Our branch carried enough flexibility, connection, memory, and chance to remain, while other branches faded as separate peoples. But the fact that we remain does not mean the others were mistakes. They were lives. They were bodies waking in weather. They were groups protecting children, making tools, using fire, learning routes, facing hunger, feeling injury, depending on one another, and answering the earth in ways we can only partly recover. To remember them carefully is to make our own humanity less arrogant and more awake. We can no longer meet a Neanderthal beside a winter shelter. We cannot ask a Denisovan where their people travelled. We cannot sit quietly on an island night beside Homo floresiensis and understand how that small world felt from the inside. Science can bring us bones, dates, layers, tools, and genetic signals. It can correct old errors and reveal hidden connections, but it cannot return the full warmth of a vanished presence. That loss remains. And perhaps that is why the story belongs not to noise, but to stillness. In the quiet, we can feel the distance without filling it too quickly. We can allow the missing branches to remain missing, while still honouring the evidence that they were real. We can understand that the word human is narrower now than it once was, and that our loneliness as a species was made slowly, through thousands of generations we did not witness. The value of knowing this is not sadness alone. It is perspective. If Earth once held several human answers, then our own answer is precious not because it was inevitable, but because it endured. We are the remaining voice of a once wider family. We carry the responsibility to speak with care, to listen to evidence, to accept uncertainty, and to see the human story not as a straight rise toward ourselves, but as a fragile branching of lives. And after all the bones, all the tools, all the fragments of DNA, and all the silence between them, one question remains open in the dark. If many kinds of humans once looked up at the same sky, what ways of being human disappeared before we ever learned how to name them?